right, welcome everyone to another episode of Keto Chat. I am your host, Carole Freeman, the creator of the Fast Track to Keto Success program. I have the honor, the privilege today of interviewing Dr. DiNicolantonio, or James, as he said I can call him. Now, if you don't know who he is yet, you're going to love the information he's going to share with us today because he is a cardiovascular research scientist and a doctor of pharmacy at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, Missouri. And he's a well-respected and internationally known scientist and expert on health and nutrition. He has contributed extensively to health policy and has even testified in front of the Canadian Senate regarding the harms of added sugar. So welcome today. I'm so excited you're here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Where are you joining us from?
So I'm joining us Rochester, New York right now.
Okay. How's your weather out there?
It's rainy.
Oh, really? Okay.
Honestly, I probably needed a break from the sun though. So I've been getting my sun in and my vitamin D for the summer.
Oh, good. Nice. Raining. All right. Well, yeah. Don't want to make too much vitamin D. Well, so you're a pharmacist. How did you get on that path? Is that run in your family, or you have? How'd you get interested in that?
Yeah, it does. Actually, my great grandfather, he started the whole pharmacist kind of lineage in my family. So he graduated from the University of Buffalo. I think it was 1928.
Oh, wow.
My mom graduated from there, and my older brother, and then I did. So it was just kind of, it's in the family blood.
It's in the blood. Okay. Are there do you guys get together at family gatherings and tell pharmacist stories and?
Yeah, just silly pharmacist jokes that no one else who isn't a pharmacist wouldn't laugh at. So.
Oh man, now I want to know what those jokes are, but like you said, we probably won't get them. So, so you just followed the family lineage. What's your, if you don't mind sharing, what's your personal health history? Like, what led you into writing this great book that we're going to talk a lot about, the salt fix?
I really started getting interested in salt in high school when I wrestled and I ran cross country. So I knew that my performance really suffered if I didn't up my salt intake. And a lot of athletes kind of inherently know that, but very few are actually dosing themselves with salt prior to exercise, even though you lose a ton of salt and iodine through sweat. And so even like back then, I knew that just the low salt advice for everyone just never made much sense. So to me, that's kind of where it started. And what I ended up doing is I started researching, obviously medicine is what I first was interested in.
Yeah.
And so I started kind of realizing that a lot of the recommendations on even medications was non-evidence-based. And kind of once I mastered that field and published a bunch of studies on medications, I started getting more focused on nutrition. And what ended up happening, it was like 6 years ago, I was bench pressing by myself, lifting heavy weight, and I tore my pectoralis tendon. And so now I couldn't lift heavy and eat all the junk food that I wanted. So I literally had to figure out from a nutrition standpoint, how can I eat something that I'm not just going to be able to burn off those calories and build all this muscle. And yeah, sure, I could handle 300-400 grams of carbs when I was bench pressing 300 pounds. When that went away, it forced me to learn to eat healthy and start digging into the evidence. So that was like another spark kind of for me why I got into nutrition. But the real, what really happened when I was a clinical pharmacist and when I was working in the community as a pharmacist, I was having patients coming up to me saying that they were dizzy, lightheaded. Their doctor put them on this low salt diet and threw them on a salt depleting diuretic just in the, hoping that it's going to lower their blood pressure. And they were just feeling really miserable, fatigued, exercise intolerance, muscle spasms. And, I kind of let them know, I said, you should go back to your doctor, tell them how you're feeling, maybe get your sodium levels checked. And patients were coming back to me saying, you were right. Our sodium levels are super low. And the doctor said I could add salt back to my diet. They cut the diuretic completely out or just reduce the dose. And the symptoms instantly improved. So when I saw that type of quick response and improvement in health, I really knew I was onto something. And so started researching and publishing in this field for about 5 years now, and specifically researched about 3 years for the book.
Oh, wow. That's super impressive. And, there's so much in there that I was just really eye-opening. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was this information needs to get out there. There's so much that we've got wrong the last 40 or 50 years about nutrition, and, our population health is really suffering because of that. And I'm glad that you wrote this book, because so many people need to know that salt isn't the poison that we've been told it is. And I love your stories in your book as well, where you share examples like that, where patients were coming in and complaining of those symptoms. And I'm wondering, I've never had that experience where my pharmacist even talked to me very much, let alone listen to what I was saying. Is that normal in pharmacists, that you have that kind of relationship with your patients, or?
Yeah, well, not really. So what ended up happening, I've always been interested in research and publishing, and I even started back in pharmacy school actually doing research. So what ended up happening was I started realizing that information is power. So one patient of mine kind of came up to me, single mom. She had had a stroke, and she was like just extremely worried, because she said, Dr. D, like, if I have another stroke, I don't know what's going to happen to my kids. And, I had recently read some research that about 90% of people with stroke have some type of sleep apnea. And so I started going through some questions with her, like, do you snore at night? Do you wake up at night? Do you feel refreshed in the morning? Do you have a headache in the morning? Answered all the questions that indicated sleep apnea. So I told her, why don't you go to your doctor, let him know you're having these symptoms, maybe get tested. She ended up having one of the worst cases of sleep apnea. So I was like directly having this really large impact on my patients because of the information that I was researching. And so I started having these deeper conversations because of that research and my interest. And almost selfishly, it was such a gratification helping these people out. It kind of sparked, more research and more interest in nutrition.
Nice. Oh, that's a really cool story. And it's amazing. Like, you're right. That's just completely transformed her health. But not only that, but you let those kids have their mom around for longer, which is maybe more important. So I mentioned about so much of what we've got about nutrition has been wrong for the last 40 years. And so, how is it that we got it so wrong about salt as well?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy when you think about it, because everybody is now dealing with this nutritional whiplash. Like, all of a sudden cholesterol's okay, and all of a sudden, high fat diets are probably okay, right? The Mediterranean diet that's high in fat is all of a sudden being, vindicated. And now salt, an essential mineral, like, why did we even demonize it? And that was one of the questions that I really wanted to answer in my book right away. It honestly all stems back from these 1977 dietary goals, where 6 dietary recommendations were put out to every single American based on just opinion, not fact. They never did systematic reviews and meta-analyses of clinical studies back in 1977. Literally, if you were like an opinion leader and you said, you know what, I think red meat is terrible for you. I think we should eat a high carb diet. I think we should cut down fat. I think we should eliminate salt. That's literally what happened. And so now that we're starting to gain evidence, we're starting to kind of question the 40 years of the low salt advice. And that's kind of I kind of walk through even more than just the last 40 years. In the book, I kind of go through over 100-year history of the quote unquote salt wars that, people on both sides have been fighting this fight for so long. But to be honest, nobody has any proof that cutting salt intake is going to reduce strokes, heart attacks, prolong life. And so many people are feeling better upping their salt intake. And so that's literally just what it comes down to. There's no evidence for it. And there's good evidence that it's actually harmful.
Yeah, I remember back in school learning about, the DASH diet, which was, if somebody had hypertension, that's what you put them on, was the DASH diet. And then when we went through the research on it, it said that, people who followed it really well, which it's a really hard diet to cut your salt that much, they saw a 10% reduction in their blood pressure going on that really rigorous diet. And I thought, well, okay, so if somebody's got like 190 over 110 blood pressure and they get a 10% reduction from all this hard work, is it even worth it? Like, is it even doing anything? Right. And that was my first kind of clue into like, well, salt reduction isn't really helping anybody get any healthier. And never mind the fact that, blood pressure, the salt isn't causing what's causing the stroke and heart attacks and things like that. So
yeah, no, that's a perfect example. So the DASH diet is kind of what a lot of the low salt advocates kind of pin their hats on, right? Well, Low salt lowers blood pressure. In the book, I kind of say, well, yeah, I mean, I can give you 1 glass of water per day and lower your blood pressure and deplete your blood volume and cause you to have dehydration. And that doesn't mean you're healthier. And that's exactly what's happening when people cut their salt intake. They're literally just dehydrating themselves. It's not even a good thing. And so when you can kind of take that away from them, what are they left with? And really the book, I try to unravel everything else all the harms of low salt that they've conveniently swept under the rug. And when you add up all the harms and you see that the benefit isn't even really a benefit, people can start understanding that low salt is absolutely terrible for you. It's probably even worse than sugar. Like not having enough of this essential mineral seems to have the exact same effects as consuming too much sugar, like causing insulin resistance and increasing insulin levels. Honestly, salt's like the antidote to sugar, and I kind of have a few chapters kind of covering that.
Yeah, well, let's dive into that a little bit more, right? Because I'm sure there's some people that, and especially those recommendations you were talking about that were made, they were, these are prudent. We're just, this is a smart thing that we're doing to protect everybody, reduce their salt. And I'm sure there's some people that, well, I've been following this low salt diet. I've been avoiding salt for so long. Like, how could it be bad? How could it possibly be bad for me?
Right. I mean, well, if you take a look at what's going on globally, there is a tremendous heat wave happening like across the globe. Like in the New York Times, there was basically an article in India, how like the highest temperatures they've ever hit. And in the UK, same thing, in the west coast of the United States. And literally people can lose between 14 and 18,000 milligrams of sodium just standing out in the heat every day. And yet we're told to consume less than 2,300 milligrams. I mean, literally people are dying of salt deficiency in the heat because they're following this low salt advice. It's honestly insanity. So, I mean, just from that aspect, but we know exercise is healthy, right? And we sweat out a ton of salt in our sweat, and that's what keeps us cool. And honestly, the studies show that even out to 8 hours, that the salt concentration in your sweat doesn't even go down. It remains high for 8 hours. I mean, I haven't seen studies going longer than 8 hours, but for 8 hours, the salt concentration in your sweat is still very high. It doesn't dip. And so that shows you that you can really become depleted in salt very quickly. And if we're trying to exercise and we're trying to be healthy, or people consume a lot of caffeine, we're slowly depleting ourselves of salt. Like caffeine is a huge salt waster. And so when I started learning all these things that almost every American is doing, 90% of Americans are consuming some form of caffeine. And we can lose up to a full teaspoon of salt in just 4 hours in the urine, consuming 4 cups of coffee. So It's a pretty tremendous loss. So, when you start adding up everything that can cause salt loss, you can start to see that, wow, maybe I really shouldn't be consciously restricting my salt intake.
Well, and how about energy drinks? That's a big hot trend in some of the younger folks now is, 4, 5, 6 energy drinks in a day. And that's, I don't know what the math is, but I think each one of those is the equivalent of 4 cups of coffee or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like every week they come out with something higher in caffeine, and it's just a bigger salt waster. Literally 10% of Americans are consuming over 1,000 milligrams of caffeine, which is an insane amount of caffeine.
Oh, wow.
Like 90 milligrams in a cup of coffee. So, to 10% of Americans to be consuming over 1,000 milligrams is astronomical. And I've never seen studies looking at the salt loss at that type of amount, but I can only imagine, 1.5 probably teaspoons of salt you're going to lose by consuming that much, maybe even more. So, yeah, definitely a big issue.
Yeah. So what are some of the health risks? Like what's associated with the inadequate salt intake?
Probably one of the coolest things that I discovered when we cut our salt intake is we obviously become deficient in salt. So the body will start pulling sodium from the bone in order to maintain adequate blood sodium levels, so you don't have like an arrhythmia, or basically the body fights to keep normal blood sodium levels. So you can have a normal blood sodium level and actually be deficient in salt. And that's the body's just pulling sodium and chloride from places in the body. And one of the places is bone. And the problem is, the osteoclasts aren't like super smart. They're not going to just strip sodium from the bone. They end up pulling magnesium and calcium with them. What ends up happening then is your blood levels of calcium and magnesium go up on low salt diets. And so it tricks the body into thinking you have too much calcium and magnesium. It shuts down the absorption of calcium and magnesium, and then it spits more out in the urine. So literally low salt diets have been shown to lead to negative calcium and magnesium balance, like literally cause you to have calcium and magnesium deficiency. And if you talk to any healthcare practitioner, they're always harping on, well, calcium's the really beneficial mineral, and magnesium, that's really beneficial too. Well, that means that salt is really beneficial, because if you don't have enough, you're going to be deficient in both of those minerals. And it gets way worse. Aldosterone levels increase when we cut our salt intake, and that spits more magnesium out the urine. So aldosterone actually causes the kidneys to lose magnesium. And the body's very smart. When it doesn't have enough salt, it'll reduce the salt concentration in your sweat, and it'll start kicking out more calcium and more magnesium. So like low salt diets are like a huge calcium and magnesium waster.
Yeah. So, it's painting a picture for me that could explain a lot of why we have such an epidemic of osteoporosis and osteopenia in women that have done such a good job at following low fat and low salt diets for all these years. It's just much more complex. They're missing. It's not that they weren't eating enough calcium.
No, 100%. So sodium is extremely important. It actually drives vitamin C into the bone. And vitamin C is super important for forming collagen and creating bone strength. And it drives vitamin C into the brain as well. And so, I mean, honestly, when I was like learning and researching all the uses of sodium in the body, it honestly just blew my mind. It's crazy how important sodium is, but it drives so many molecules in and out of cells. It's honestly unbelievable.
Yeah, I think most people have no idea that it's actually an essential mineral. It's an essential nutrient that we need, not just something that's stuck on the pretzels that we eat. One of my clients, oh gosh, she just had like kind of a stomach flu type thing where she wasn't keeping any solid foods down for a couple of days, and her doctor told her to, well, make sure you drink some Gatorade and eat some pretzels so you can get some salt. And she's like, well, why don't I just have some salt then? Have a salty broth or something. He's like, well, you need, they weren't even thinking about other ways of being able to get salt. Like, we're so programmed that like salt comes in junk food. So that's the only way we get salt.
Right. Yeah. Like it's okay to recommend salt, like with a high carb intake, but we shouldn't be recommending salt just alone, because salt's not good for us. So somehow high carb diets are going to wipe out the quote unquote harms of salt.
Yeah. Well, and I worked alongside dietitians in the past that was their primary go-to of, well, how you eat less salt is eat less processed foods, because they didn't think about any other way that it, could actually be beneficial for them too. So, so osteoporosis, what other health things have you run into, or conditions and diseases that are very strongly likely correlated with low salt intake?
Yeah. Well, low salt intake honestly probably causes the very disease states that we think it prevents. So low salt diets probably cause hypertension, atherosclerosis, strokes.
People's minds right now are just exploding, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's because what ends up happening when we cut our salt intake, all the artery stiffening hormones increase by threefold. And we block those hormones with medications to reduce strokes and heart attacks. So those hormones are called renin, angiotensin 2, aldosterone. They stiffen the arteries. They can lead to left ventricular hypertrophy and heart failure. They increase atherosclerosis formation. I mean, low salt diets in animals actually increase atherosclerosis. So when you also look at low salt diets, actually chronically activate the stress hormones, noradrenaline and adrenaline. So almost everybody's going to have an increase in heart rate when they cut their salt intake. And that almost always outweighs any type of blood pressure lowering effect, which we've already said is probably a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And so to even in the book, I kind of compare, well, what's more important, a 1 point reduction in blood pressure or a 4 beat per minute increase in heart rate? And that's not even getting into the insulin resistance and the increase in artery stiffening hormones and all these other harms that are happening on low salt intakes, like negative calcium and magnesium balance. So I honestly believe that low salt diets cause hypertension and cardiovascular disease. And they're tremendously stressful on the heart because they raise heart rate, and they're very stressful on the kidneys. And so one of the very eye-opening points I realized how our bodies handle salt is our blood is extremely salty, and the kidneys are constantly filtering our salty blood out. And they actually have to actively reabsorb 3.5 pounds of salt every single day. So the
3.5
heart
pounds. That's amazing.
3.5 pounds of salt. So it's filtering a teaspoon of salt, which is supposedly terrible for us, every 5 minutes. He's like, it's like a joke, you
When
know?
you put that in perspective, it's crazy making. It's so funny.
Yeah. And the body has to keep and hold on to that salty blood. And if it loses any of the salt, it kind of freaks out. It's very easy to let extra salt go. Requires no energy on the body. But to have to reabsorb salt when you're on a low salt diet is a tremendous amount of energy. So the kidney spends 60% of their basal metabolic rate just reabsorbing salt constantly. And so if you eat more, the kidneys are like, yes, I don't have to reabsorb more salt. I can just let some freely pass without having to actively reabsorb it. So we've always feared salt as being like a salt bomb on the kidneys, and it's actually a relief on the kidneys.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a totally different perspective too. And so then one of the big things I learned from your book was talking about the relation with insulin and the kidneys' control over salt as well. And, I imagine you can see that low salt can lead to insulin resistance. Is it a chicken and an egg thing?
Yeah. It basically, how you can kind of look at it is insulin helps the kidneys retain more salt. So when we cut our salt intake, if we have a higher elevated level of insulin, that's helping the kidneys retain more. So the body becomes insulin resistant to raise insulin levels to help the kidneys reabsorb more salt. And what's crazy is the blood vessels become resistant to the vasodilating properties of insulin. And so literally your peripheral vascular resistance, like the stiffening of your arteries, goes up on those salt diets. And that's because it's trying to maintain blood volume, right? It can't just, the arteries don't want to dilate because blood volume is down. They got to constrict. And so now the heart's pumping against a more constricted artery, and that can stress the heart out even more on top of the high heart rate. So literally low salt diets may actually lead to heart failure, because if you're pumping your heart rate, I've seen studies that have shown low salt diets increase heart rate by more than 25%. So if someone's heart rate is 80 beats per minute and it's increasing it by 25, that's a 20 beat per minute increase. That is an insane rise in heart rate. And you're doing that every single minute, 20 beats per minute, every single minute more for the rest of your life. If supposedly you only have a set amount of heartbeats, low salt diets are going to, they're going to put you to your grave a lot quicker if that's true, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Oh yeah. Wow. So, okay. So knowing all this and all the different correlations to, disease states, who do you recommend in your book to consume more salt?
Well, kind of go through how the ketogenic diet and starting the ketogenic diet can lead to Atkins flu or keto flu. And some people know what that is. They've experienced it. Honestly, most people who start a ketogenic diet do experience it. And honestly, it prevents a lot of people from continuing on because it's very scary, especially the first week, right? And what ends up happening is people are consuming like 400 grams of carbs and they just want to just fly down to 60 or less, right? And what ends up happening is your insulin levels they basically skyfall. And some people's kidneys have become so dependent on insulin to reabsorb salt that when they drop the insulin, the kidneys are just spilling salt. And so, if you talk to some of the leading experts, most people who are starting or initiating a ketogenic diet, they need an additional about 2 grams of sodium per day for the first week, and then about an additional gram of sodium per day for the next week. But some people who have really bad insulin resistance and their kidneys have been so dependent on insulin to reabsorb salt, they may spill salt for a lot longer. So you really got to go with your symptomatology. So if you're still feeling dizzy or your heart rate's jacked up or you have exercise intolerance, your muscle spasm, all these kind of like volume depleting type of signals, that's a signal that you're losing too much salt as well.
Yeah, and I teach my clients to think of salt as their master electrolyte, because a lot of people, out there that don't know exactly how to do a ketogenic diet quite right will just say, well, make sure you're supplementing with electrolytes. And what I found is that if people keep their sodium in check, that they don't need to supplement with a lot of those for the reasons you were talking about. It doesn't signal the body that they need to release, magnesium and calcium from the bones at the same time. I found that's really great. But the heart rate one, I didn't think about that one being correlated to. That's another one that's really important to notice, because I know sometimes people start out with a ketogenic diet, and they can't figure out, like, why is my heart racing all the time? Not enough salt.
Yeah, exactly. And another patient population, so to speak, that is obviously needs more salt is people who exercise. And I kind of go through in the book how much salt we lose per hour of exercise, but we also lose a lot of iodine, and only certain salts have good amounts of iodine. And we actually lose a tremendous amount of iodine. Like the average person is going to lose 50 micrograms, and we can lose 100 or more micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise. And, 30 countries currently are considered iodine deficient, and about 50 to 60 are iodine insufficient. So when you start adding exercise and people are sweating out iodine, and then they're told to go on a low salt diet, I mean, it's crazy. But when you are deficient in iodine, you can become hypothyroid. So your metabolism is literally suffering because you're not getting enough salt, because certain good salts provide iodine. And so I kind of cover some salts in the book that have good amounts and which ones are kind of my favorite. But that's another question I'm always getting, is like, what salt is the best salt?
Yeah. Because I've had family members that say they don't want to consume sea salt because they need the iodine. And so then they're consuming table salt because of that, which, it's going to be a lot more iodine in it than some of the sea salts out there. It depends on how refined they are. I like the recommendations that you make in the book too, because you actually spell it out. I hadn't seen that before, where anybody'd shown the actual analysis of what level of iodine were in the different types of sea salt.
Yeah, when I started researching the difference, I mean, I never really thought there was such a big difference between just like table salt and other salts, right? Like inherently, most people don't really think there's a difference, and I actually do. But I will say that I think some of the claims on Himalayan salt are a little overboard, right? The Himalayan salt, so we got 84 minerals, and like in my mineral analysis, I kind of show you that a lot of them are honestly a joke when it comes to the actual amount. But iodine is one that is real. So Himalayan salt absolutely has good amounts of iodine, but it's such a wide range. I've seen batches that have had less than 100 micrograms per 10 grams of salt, and I've seen other batches with 1,000 micrograms or 1 milligram. So tremendous range, which is why I stay away from Himalayan. But Himalayan might actually even have some heavy metals in it, and there's some other like, I think it's like uranium or some other crazy metals that you really don't want. So I kind of stay away from Himalayan. But like they have a few radioactive metals. But there's two salts that I really like. So in the book, I do cover Redmond, and Redmond is from an ancient dried up ocean bed. So you're getting a salt that doesn't have the microplastics in it from modern day sea salts, from modern day oceans. And I never even thought about that. Like, who would have thought salt is so nuanced? Like,
yeah.
Like the location of salt can actually make a difference in regarding heavy metals and microplastics. But another salt that I recently discovered is called Ancient Lake's magnesium infused salt. And that is from an ancient lake as well. So it's
okay. I'll write that one down here.
Yeah, it's from Lake Deborah in Australia. And it's really cool how the lake was formed. Basically, over 3 million years, like a sea breeze carried the salt 500 kilometers inland and just created this like ancient like lake. And
wow,
they infused the salt with this like magnesium brine underneath the salt crust. And so it's got the highest magnesium I've ever seen of any salt. And so Celtic is always claimed to be the highest. It's got about 40 milligrams of magnesium per 10 grams of salt. But the Ancient Lake's magnesium infused salt has 44 milligrams of magnesium per 10 grams of salt. But it also has really good levels of iodine as well. And so you don't normally see that. You don't normally see a high magnesium salt with good amounts of iodine. So Celtic has basically no iodine, but it's got a good amount of magnesium. So Ancient Lake salt, though, is a little bit, it's more of a wet salt. And so, like, I really like it for workouts. Like, right now it comes in pouches, and like who wants to bring a salt shaker to the gym? Like, you honestly look insane. But it's got this cool little pouch. And it's got such a unique flavor. Like, it's the most intense flavor. So it like really activates and hits me for working out. So I really like that one before I work out. Nice.
Well, I want to ask you about the dextrose, the sugar that's in table salt. Now, I posted something about how dextrose in table salt And it struck the biggest debate I've ever had on my own Facebook page about people saying, well, you have to have it because of the iodine that's in there. And, what I could dig up was that the reason they say that they add dextrose to table salt is to protect the iodine. But I couldn't find any mechanism of action for that. And the salts you're talking about that are high in iodine, they don't have to have sugar in there to protect that. Do you have any idea, if that's true, why they put that in there?
Yeah, that would make no sense because even the table salt without iodine, they add dextrose to it. And like you said, all the salts with iodine, they don't have dextrose. And I've never seen anything remotely to indicate that it's going to protect like the iodine in there. So no, I think that's pretty much a false statement.
I figured it just had to do with food manufacturers knowing that they add just a little bit of sugar to anything. People think it tastes better and they'll prefer that brand over other ones. So it might have been just along the lines of the whole sugar cereal wars where sugar just got thrown into everything. Or
yeah, right. I mean, they even put sugar in cigarettes. Like, it's crazy. Yeah, and honestly, like before, I never even looked at the back of a Morton salt. Like, I never even knew they put in dextrose. But yeah, I mean, in any type of food manufacturer's mind, if I add sugar, it's going to cause people to like it more, and it's cheap. So why not throw it in there, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting that that's still out there on their websites is, the reason the sugar's in there is to protect the iodine. But I even had a friend of mine that was really into the science stuff, and she started looking into animal feed, which has, salt, iodine, and she says they don't put sugar in that. So why is it that they have to put it in human salt? All right, so
because they would rather have humans addicted to the dextrose than animals, right?
Yeah. Oh man, can you imagine the animals having all the sugar addiction? Well, speaking of sugar addiction, and let's talk about what you found about how low salt is associated with sugar and drug addiction.
Yeah. And I like to preface it by saying this isn't just like some theory. Like, I have an entire chapter with over 100 references on this topic. And I actually wrote an entire article in Vice about this topic. And it's one of the most interesting topics in the book is that literally salt deficiency can potentially drive sugar and drug addiction. And there's actually really good evidence behind it. And so, I mean, even animal studies show that when they deplete animals of salt, it actually cross-sensitizes with drugs of abuse. It makes literally drugs like amphetamine and cocaine more addictive. And so if you think about it, we've always known that, like, if an animal is depleted in salt, they somehow know to go and find a salt lick, right? Like, how the heck do they know to do that? They're not like smart and intelligent, and they're not like, oh, I'm going to find that white stuff that like saves me when I'm deficient. The brain actually activates the reward system when animals become depleted in salt. That's the saving mechanism. And so you get more cravings. And when you find that substance, you actually consume more of it because you have an activated reward in the brain. And so that's the body's smart way of getting that essential mineral so animals don't die. Same thing applies with humans. People want to say that happens in animals, and yet they want to ignore that same biological mechanism, that connection in the brain with salt intake. And that reward system can be hijacked then by sugar and drugs of abuse when it's activated when we're eating low salt diets or when we're salt deficient. And so that can be potentially why people are struggling to cut their carbs is they're cutting their carbs, they're salt deficient, and now their reward system is even more activated for carbs. So they're like freaking out, they're craving carbs even more when they try to cut them because they're spilling more salt. And it's like this perpetual vicious cycle.
Okay. Yeah, so low sodium intake is going to increase your cravings for sugar and carbs. Now, have you seen, can it reverse that? So if somebody's already gone down that path of drug addiction and they're in recovery, and carb addiction, trying to be in recovery, can increasing salts counteract that, or is it too late?
Yeah, so when you think about it, it's what ends up happening when you start consuming sugar is you start basically releasing endogenous opioids. Your body actually becomes addicted to your own opioids that you're releasing. And what ends up happening too is you're also releasing dopamine. And so the constant high levels of dopamine eventually cause you to have a deficiency in dopamine. And so what ends up happening is the body literally has a withdrawal. It's not like you're strung out, right? But your brain is deficient in dopamine, during periods when you're not consuming sugar. And so when you slowly stop consuming sugar, you can start fixing that change in your dopamine levels, and you can start to become less addicted to the endogenous opioids. And when you up your salt intake, your endogenous opioids are going to be less addictive because your reward system is now down-regulated when you up your salt intake.
So if they could just have a bunch of containers of salt around in addiction center or recovery centers instead of all the sugar and sweets and cigarettes and coffee that are doing the opposite and taking, causing them to excrete even more salt, we probably see.
And there's the other aspect is a physiological addiction. So when you become insulin resistant, you start not being able to tap into your own fat stores and your own protein stores. So literally your body starts only being able to efficiently utilize carbohydrate and sugar. So you're craving that molecule, that macronutrient, because you're insulin resistant, because it's the only macronutrient you can efficiently utilize. And so when you go on a low salt diet, you're making your insulin resistance much worse. And so that can also potentially be causing you to be craving more sugar, because you're ending up not utilizing other macronutrients well, so you crave it more. And then if you're more insulin resistant, you're going to have higher basically peaks when you consume carbs. You're going to crash, and then that vicious cycle just continues.
Yeah. So it's making me wonder, can we consume too much salt? Because I know some of the people that I work with, they're like, great, salt is a cure-all for everything. And, now I'm just going to eat spoonfuls of it. Can we consume too much?
Yeah. So, honestly, in general, no, you can't. And so for the last 10,000 years, we've consumed an extremely high salt diet because salt was our only food preservative. We didn't have refrigerators. And so we consumed, in Sweden, the average person was estimated to consume 100 grams of salt per day. And so we consume about 8 grams of salt per day. Yeah. And so literally everything was salted, right? Like even a couple hundred years ago, in Europe in the 1700s, the average consumption was 70 grams, so about 10 times what we consume now. And in the 1500s, it was 40 grams. The Romans consumed 25 grams of salt. The longest living people on the planet right now, Japan and South Korea, they consume the highest amounts of salt. So can we consume more salt? I would say if we do, we may live longer. And can we overconsume salt? The clinical studies that I have looked at, they've tested about 90 grams of salt, and the kidneys just get rid of it. No problem. And like we said, because they filter 3.5 pounds of salt per day. And so unless you have some really specific disease state, I go through the book, some people have Little's syndrome and you just treat it with a medication, or some people have Cushing's and you can just treat it with a medication. You don't need to limit salt in where food is bland. And some people have really high aldosterone levels, and you can just like remove the tumor in the adrenal glands that are causing you to secrete high amounts of aldosterone, or you can take spironolactone. You don't have to limit salt. And so only certain people are going to over retain salt. And again, it's the wrong white crystal that we've blamed, because sugar can cause us to not only over retain salt, but in the book, I show that after a while, sugar can lead to 22 ways how sugar leads to salt deficiency. Because sugar literally can damage the kidneys, where the kidneys start spilling salt, and they damage the intestine and cause us to not being able to absorb salt well. And I counsel patients with autoimmune diseases, with inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. They don't absorb salt well. And so they are really at risk of salt deficiency. And so we were kind of talking about some of the anecdotes. I literally have 2 family members who were put on low salt diets. They both wound up with severely low sodium levels in the blood, to the point where they literally almost died, and severe dehydration, had to be hospitalized. And one of my family members had their colon removed, and the colon helps us absorb salt. And so it's just kind of crazy how, a lot of medications cause us to lose salt, and a lot of disease states cause us to lose salt. So, and honestly, even looking at just low sodium levels in the blood, it's the most common electrolyte abnormality in both the inpatient and outpatient setting. And then when you start looking at actual people that are deficient in salts, just symptomatically, where they have elevated like BUNs, and even though they're consuming normal amounts of water, or they have elevations in heart rate when going from a seated to a standing position, or they're really dizzy, you start adding it up, millions and millions of people are probably deficient in salt, even if they have normal blood sodium levels.
Yeah, right, right. And I have found, clinically working with people that they can tolerate about half a teaspoon at any one time, as far as like if they're just trying to take a shot of salt. If they try to do more than that, they end up with diarrhea, nausea, and maybe even vomiting. But as far as they could do that probably every hour, and that wouldn't be too much. But
yeah, no. And what's cool is I got some cool ways in the book because trying to take it straight up can be difficult. I can do garlic salt straight up better than I can do just plain salt. But what's really crazy is there was a study published in the Lancet. They took over 2,000 pregnant women, and they compared low salt, thinking that would be beneficial, to high salt. And low salt like doubled miscarriages. It tripled perinatal deaths. So children dying between day 0 and 30, 3 times the death rate in those mothers who are restricting their salt intake. Their babies were dying at 3 times the rate. And it literally, the salt treated their preeclampsia. They were giving these women up to 300 to 400 grams of salt a day to treat their preeclampsia. I wouldn't recommend that much. That's kind of crazy. I think they went overboard, but they got these people to tolerate it by doing mixtures of like lemon, lime, lemonade, stuff like that. So there's ways to integrate salt. Like you said, trying to take it straight up, probably most people are only going to be able to tolerate a half a teaspoon, but there's ways to do it if you need to consume more.
Yeah, and like a heated broth ends up being a really good way because it dissolves in there. I found that's a much easier way for people to get a lot more in. They enjoy the taste of it too. So I want to ask you too about, in your book you recommend that people just follow their taste for salt and their cravings for salt. But I have run across, several, especially women, that have been doing a really good job at following low salt recommendations forever. And, they don't salt their food. They don't use salt cooking. And they find that they just don't like the taste of salt. And they say they're just like turned off of it because their taste buds are so used to searching for salt in the food that they're eating. And so what do you say about that when people just follow a low salt diet forever and they just say they don't even have a taste for salt anymore?
I think what ends up happening is when you follow a low salt diet, you become deficient in a lot of minerals. And so a lot of those minerals actually help with your tastes.
Oh, yeah.
Like a deficiency in zinc messes up your taste receptors. And there's other mineral deficiencies that can cause that as well. So that's potentially what's going on. And what's cool about salt, it's the only taste out of our 5 tastes that if you get too much, the taste receptors actually flip and provide us an aversion signal. And everybody knows that. Everybody who's consumed too much salt, it goes like, whoa, that's way too much. That's way too salty. No one has ever gone, whoa, that's way too sugary. I don't want another piece of cake or another chocolate chip cookie, right? We want more of that taste. So
that steak is too meaty. Whoa.
yeah, that's exactly. But no, salt just again, because it's an essential mineral, our body has so many defense mechanisms of controlling not getting enough. And if we get too much, kind of down-regulating those receptors on the tongue.
Yeah. Well, and the whole exit strategy as well, like the body getting rid of it too much if you take it all at one time as well, which it does with a lot of minerals. So yeah, that's great. I have a silly thought for you. You're talking about the blood being, when really, really salty. So what if vampires have had it right all along, that we need to be consuming blood as one of our salts? And there are societies actually that do that, right? That's one of the places that they get their salt is from the blood of animals.
Yeah, no, the Maasai do that, and they actually have been known to drink the urine of their cattle to get salt. And one of the biggest misconceptions, even in the paleo world, is that there was this really main paper from like the two fathers of basically the paleo movement. It was published, I think, in like 1978. And I think it was Eaton and Boyd were the 2 authors in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they said that even if you consume an all meat diet, you're only going to get 1,400 milligrams of sodium. So some of the low salt advocates kind of say, well, even if we consumed meat, we would have never been consuming 3,000 milligrams. We only consumed 1,400. The problem is that paper didn't look at salty sources like blood, which we did consume. We consumed the entire animal back for the last 3 million years, right? And so we consumed blood and interstitial fluid and organs and skin, all salty, but that was left out of the paper. And we also consumed salty insects, and we would go to salt licks. Animals weren't the only, whatever you want to call them, organisms going to salt licks. Humans would either follow animals to salt licks or they would just find them themselves. And if they were deficient, they knew where that salt lick was. And so, that's just another kind of dogma that I'm trying to break as well in the paleo world, is that from an evolutionary perspective, even if we didn't live near the coast and didn't consume salty seafood, we could get it through insects, through animals, even tiger nuts. There was one study that tested 6 different batches. 5 of the 6 tiger nuts had about 3,000 milligrams of sodium per 3.5 ounces. And tiger nuts were absolutely available during evolutionary times. You could just pluck them out of the ground and consume them. So, we actually consume salty soils too. Clays, the piths of trees have a lot of salt. And I kind of go in the book how gorillas would follow elephants. Elephants would uproot trees to get at the salty soil. They would even go into caves to lick the salt off the caves. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it's not difficult to get a lot of salt.
I wonder, you have me thinking now about our family dog. He's an 8-month-old puppy, and he's actually my son's dog, and they try really hard to give him a really optimal diet. But I'm wondering, like, maybe he needs some more salt as well, because I don't think they add salt to dog food. And he's been licking like the water around my plants and things like that. It makes me wonder, like, is he trying to get the salty soil? Does he need more salt?
Yeah, it's funny too. If you like go out for a run, anyone who has a pet knows like that a dog will absolutely just start licking you. And
yes.
They probably, I don't know if it happens with cats too, maybe, yeah. But I know dogs for sure. Because I have a dog, my dog will definitely start licking me, probably for the salt. I don't know if they sweat though, like humans though, if they lose salt like we do. But
I wonder if I put out a bowl of salty water for him. I'm gonna do that tonight and see what he does, see if he likes that. Because I had the idea of like, well, salt's bad for dogs, and so don't give them any bacon or anything like that.
Well, just don't do too much. Maybe research like how dogs sweat, because I don't know if they sweat out salt like we do.
They sweat out their tongue. I know that they don't sweat normally there, but
that's true. That's a good point.
I'm curious then, if they have the same salt taste receptor, right? That they would seek out that salt. So.
Yeah, they were definitely not eating, like Kibble's dog food, right? Like they were definitely getting sources of salt in blood for sure. So
yeah, that's totally. Now I'm really, really curious about that. So that's great. Well, so let's, speaking of running and your dog licking you when you're all salty, let's, go dive into the sports side of this. So, how do people make sure they get enough salt? And I have a really interesting story about that. Is when I was in school, our professor shared with us about hyponatremia, low sodium, or severe sodium deficiency, or what would be acute sodium deficiency in athletes. And she herself had been into martial arts and had experienced it during a match, and so I knew the story of it. And then we also have the tragic story of the radio show where the woman was drink. What was it? Hold your wee for a wee. Did you hear about that story? That so it was some radio show in California, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, where they had a competition where they invited people to come and drink lots and lots of water, and whoever could not go to the bathroom the longest was going to win the wee. And it was on-air broadcast, and this woman ended up dying of hyponatremia because she had drank so much water and then didn't urinate. She diluted her sodium so much that she died of excess water. And I always think about this when people have these external ideas of like, you have to drink a gallon of water every day, like these weird numbers that people come up with of the amount of water you have to drink while they're not, exercising or anything like that. And I myself, then I was doing a bicycle training a few summers ago here in the Seattle area, and it was, mid 80s, and we were out riding like 30 or 40 miles in the heat. And, I'm, a natural whole foodist, and everybody else is drinking Gatorade, and I'm like, that's garbage. I've just got my seaweed snacks. That's going to be enough for me. And I wasn't an experienced athlete or anything like that. At the end of the drive home afterwards, I was like, I feel really funny. And I started getting tunnel vision, and I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. But I remembered the story that my professor had told me about, the experience of what hyponatremia is. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to pull over and buy some Gatorade or something. And I stopped at a convenience store, and I still remember pulling two things out of the cooler and trying to decide whether I wanted artificial dye or artificial something else. And I finally just grabbed one of them, and I went home that night and I started putting salt into cups of water, and I just drank, I don't know how many teaspoons of salt I drank that night, but it was like the best tasting beverage I'd ever had was just salt in water that night. And so I think it's highly underrated is how much sodium people lose when they're exercising, and they think if they're just drinking Gatorade or just drinking lots of water that they're going to be okay. But tell us more then about, how much salt should somebody be consuming? Even just somebody who just goes to the gym once in a while.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good point, is that everybody is consuming water. They think that's enough when they're sweating. They just forget that they lose a ton of salt in their sweat. And so that adds to the problem because it's diluting the sodium levels in the blood. And what's also happening is when you don't get enough salt, you can't get rid of that extra water without the salt. And so your body's retaining more water because of that in that aspect. So there's a few things. So I guess in general, most people are going to lose about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise. Okay. And it depends on your activity level. It depends on the temperature outside, your clothing, your genetics, how much salt you've been consuming. If you're really deficient in salt, you're not going to sweat out as much. If you're eating good amounts, you're going to sweat out a little bit more. So there's a ton of factors, but in general, that's a good rule of thumb, is about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise. But when you start getting into temperatures like 90 and above, you can start losing a teaspoon or more of salt per hour. And so in the book, I show how one person lost about 3 teaspoons of salt in just 1 hour of soccer practice when I think the temperature was around like 95, 96, something like that. So that's a tremendous amount of salt. I mean, if we're told to consume less than a teaspoon, and some people could be losing 3 teaspoons in an hour of exercise. I mean, so let's say you follow the low salt device, you're consuming 2 grams of sodium and you sweat it out 6,000 milligrams. That's 4,000 milligrams. That's more than what's in an entire liter of your blood. And if you just have a 10% drop in your blood level of sodium, you can literally die. So if you don't have sodium stores to pull from, you can literally kill someone pretty quickly if they're restricting their salt intake in the heat. And that's kind of what's happening right now around the world, is there's a lot of people dying. They're just saying they're dying of the heat wave, right? And it's actually they're dying because they're not putting back the salt that they're being depleted of. Everyone's drinking the water and making the situation potentially worse by not adding the salt back.
So is that really what heat stroke or heat exhaustion is, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much exactly what it is. Ancel Keys actually showed that in 1940s. He was good for something. But yeah, like your core temperature goes up on a low salt diet in the heat. And part of the reason why is salt allows your blood vessels to dilate, which you can release more heat, and it improves blood circulation. And you can sweat more. And so you're producing more sweat, and that's how we thermoregulate. And so your core body temperature goes up when you are on a low salt diet in the heat. And if you just add the salt back, your core body temperature will go down. And so people always use the term heat stroke, and really maybe it should be like salt deficiency stroke, but yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Wow. So I've got a lot of friends that live in the Phoenix area, and they're, 110, 120s right now. And when you're there, they talk about, hydrate, make sure you hydrate, but they leave out the part of hydration is getting more salt as well. So I'll make sure I share this video with them too. Make sure you guys eat more salt.
Yeah, no, you brought up a good point too. Is like, when you went to the store to try to figure out, well, what am I going to even take? You were kind of comparing like one evil to another, right? Like artificial Gatorade, people can, what I do is I make like a keto aid, like a lemon lime, like salt mixture, and without the sugar, and it tastes phenomenal. Like a lot of people enjoy the lime with the salt, and a lot of people enjoy alcoholic beverages with lime and salt as well. So it just kind of seems to go hand in hand.
Yeah, well, and it's that reminds me, when I was in Austin, Texas, what was it, last month or the month before, for Paleo FX, my first time there, and we stopped in one of the convenience stores to get some water and stuff, and they had this whole section in the store there of these little flavored salts. And there was a lime salt and a chili salt and all these things. And it really struck me as that, that really hot, humid area, they naturally craved saltier things. And so they had a whole section in there. Now I live in the Seattle area. We don't get a lot of hot, humid, sweaty days. And so there's not as much of that around here, but we definitely don't have any of the salt. So it was a whole line of flavored salt. So they definitely have a taste for that and sell more of those products because of that.
Yeah, they're certainly ahead of the curve. And I will say that the sports drinks, they're not providing enough salt. And the reason is because who wants to drink something as salty as our own sweat? But regardless of all that, you're still losing that amount of salt, right? And so I think Gatorade and Powerade only have like 350 milligrams of sodium per liter. And, we're losing between about 850 to 1250 milligrams of sodium. So it's like 3 to 4 times less in salt that you actually need, which is why most people need to add salt, because it's going to be, you don't want to drink something that is as salty as your own sweat. So the way to do it is, like you kind of said, like more like a shot, or just taking it. If it's garlic salt, some people can handle a half a teaspoon straight up. But if you don't add that extra salt, it's not even that you're not replacing what's lost. When you dose yourself with salt, and I can't specifically give that as a health recommendation to anybody, right?
Yeah.
Because we know what's going on. Like when anyone recommends anything to anyone, they're all of a sudden sued, or they're in front of a board of practitioners. But there are legitimate like physiological effects of dosing yourself with salt. Like it is a huge vasodilator, and so it's possible that even a half a teaspoon isn't enough. And there's all these potential benefits of increasing blood circulation and lowering your heart rate even further for exercise. And so, there was one study that showed 2,300 milligrams of sodium per liter consumed did reduce dehydration. It reduced fluid loss. So 2,300 milligrams of sodium is a full teaspoon of salt. And most people are going to lose about a liter of fluid per hour of exercise. So it goes to show you that there are studies that have shown that adding a high amount of salt to a liter of fluid, which isn't going to taste good. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. You would want to integrate the salt on its own and then add the fluid. There's real benefits to that.
I just realized the shortcut that Gatorade and other sports drinks are doing is that they've got sugar in them. So they're giving you the insulin response, and then your kidneys are going to retain more salt because of that. And sugar is cheaper than salt. So let's just keep giving people more sugar. And plus they think it tastes better, so they're going to buy more of it. So
yeah, no, exactly. And the real issues begin when your body, what ends up happening is when it's so damaged. Can you still see me? I lost you for a second. Okay.
Yeah, I can see you. Yeah.
When we start losing our internal C is when we start really getting some serious issues. So when sugar starts damaging the intestine and starts damaging the kidneys, and we can't absorb salt anymore, and we start spilling it out the kidneys, you can literally die within hours. And there are a lot of salt wasting kidney diseases out there. I'm not going to list them all. I have a lot of them listed in the book, but when you've consumed decades worth of sugar, now all of a sudden you can't hold on to your internal ocean, and you start spilling salt, and it's a huge issue.
Wow. Yeah. So much good stuff here. So, in just wrapping this up, was there anything else that you were hoping I would ask you about, or that you want to share now, or?
No, honestly, we covered a lot. I'm pretty good. I think we did it justice.
Yeah, good. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on here, and I just have one final question for you. Ask everybody on my interviews is that meteors coming towards Earth today. It's your very last day on the planet. What's your last meal going to be?
Oh my gosh, it honestly would probably just be like a juicy steak with a ton of salt. Like I would lather that baby up with salt and just, grill it real nice. And what's really interesting is that salt not only provides flavor, but when you cook it, it provides a crust, and it traps in a lot of flavor and juices. And so what I do is when I cook pork chops, I'll like layer the sides with salt, like olive oil, good salt, pepper, get a nice sear, trap in the moisture. And then I'll kind of tilt the plate a little bit like this.
Okay.
And I'll let all the salty juices form like this nice salty soup, and then I'll put a ton of spinach in it. And so salt allows you to eat healthy foods, like bitter foods you never would have consumed. So I always like to say salt is our key. It's our gateway. It's a natural substance to not only eating healthy, but to exercising more. And what's better than that?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ways to make a prime rib is do like a real thick salt crust on it. So that's great. Yeah, well, James, thank you so much for being here and sharing this information. And hopefully we change some more lives with this information, because it's certainly a lot different than a lot of people have been doing for a long time. So I appreciate being here. If you guys like this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. And that's all for now. Bye, everybody.